My project all began when I started looking into folk stories. A folk story is an old story that's been told again and again, often for generations. Folk tales are stories in the oral tradition, or tales that people tell each other out loud, rather than stories in written form. They're closely related to many storytelling traditions, including fables, myths, and fairy tales. When I think about the Welsh version of folk stories, it's very hard not to think of the Mabinogion. The Mabinogion was a collective of 12 tales from Welsh myths. The tales of the Mabinogion were preserved in two manuscripts, the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hargest. It was around the 12th or 13th century. The tales themselves concern the trials and tribulations of various Welsh royals' families, Roman emperors, plagues, romance, voyages, mythical beasts, white horses, and one of the earliest origin of the Arthurian legend. The stories involved elements of bravery, love, betrayal. The authors of the stories are unknown, having been passed down from generation to generation through the oral tradition, with each teller adding their own take. It wasn't until the 19th century when a woman from Lincolnshire, who fell in love with the Welsh language, translated these tales into English for the very first time, that they became known all over Europe and the rest of the world. Lady Charlotte Guest, whose husband John owned the Dowley's Iron Works, collected the 11 tales and gave them the title of the Mabinogion, which was mistakenly believed to be the Pool of the Mabinogi, a loose translation of A Tale of Hero's Boyhood. After a lot of exploration and research into the Mabinogion, it only confirmed my initial drive and desire of exploring the stories behind place names. Although I love the tales told in the Mabinogion and the moral codes behind them, I have a deeper connection to the tales behind the names of places, and I think they shaped me as a person due to me being immersed within them and the landscapes that surround me. The best way to explain this is through the example of a tale behind a place name. An example of this is Beard Gelert, which translates to Gelert's grave. According to legend, the stone monument in the field marks the resting place of Gelert, the faithful hound of the medieval Welsh prince Llewellyn the Great. The story as written on the tombstone reads, in the 13th century, Llewellyn, Prince of North Wales, had a palace at Beard Gelert. One day he went hunting without Gelert, the faithful hound, who was unaccountably absent. On Llewellyn's return, Gelert met him and he noticed he was smeared in blood. The prince, alarmed, went to find his son, and saw the infant cot empty, the bedclothes and floor covered with blood. The frantic father plunged his sword into the hound's side, thinking it had killed his heir. The dog's dying yell was answered by a child's cry. Llewellyn searched and discovered his boy unharmed, but nearby lay the body of a mighty wolf, which Gelert had slain. The prince, filled with remorse, is said never to have smiled again. He buried Gelert here. An interesting turn of events my mother mentioned while discussing my project about a rumour of how this story began.
Well, Lleucu, the story goes that your great, 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 probably greater still grandparents, they were running the Goat Hotel in Beddgelert, and the tourists had stopped coming, so they come up with this plan of explaining why Beddgelert was called Beddgelert, referencing obviously to the story of Llewellyn and this dog Gelert, who had been left to mind the baby and was killed. Anyway, it proved very successful. Tourists have been flocking there ever since.
Carrying on from this, I keep the stories told by my father and mother dear to my heart. After more research into place names, the story that stood out to me was one I thought a lot about when I was younger. I remember my father telling me a story about a witch hunt that took place on the mountain we could see from the opposite side of the valley from our family farm. The mountain is called Penhyd Garach, which translates to Peak of the Slippery Witch. I think about this story often over the years, but I realised I'd never really discussed the story much in my adult life. So when I was looking into folk stories, I decided to revisit it and research it further. To my surprise, nothing was really found. I found a book on the subject of our county's place name origins. I found a lot of interesting explanations for strange place names, such as Llyn Idwal, which is named after the Prince Idwal Foel, a grandson of Rhodri Fawr, one of the ancient kings of Wales. Legend states that the king's unfortunate offspring was murdered by being drowned in the lake. In fact, Idwal IV died in the battle against the Saxons, and an alternate version claims that he was cremated beside the lake, which is a burial custom for Celtic nobility. It was said that after his death, there have been no sightings of birds flying above the lake. After a thorough search, no explanation for Penrhydderach could be found within a written form. Strange, as this is such a descriptive word for a mountain. I would have thought there would have been plenty of material. I decided to interview my father, as he was one of the ones that originally told me the tale as a child. I then made a shadow video to accompany my father's version of the tale. I decided to make it in this format as a nod to a very early form of storytelling.
Hello, my name is Rheinald Williams, and I've been told by my daughter, Lleucu, to say the story I have told her about the naming of mountain and passes in the Canada Range. This I first heard from my brother Lewis, who heard it from our cousin. These iconic names had always intrigued me, and when I heard the story, it all made sense to me. And this shows the richness of our Welsh heritage, culture and language. And I think this story has been passed down from one generation to the next. And it really has to be a true story. Or how else can you explain the meaning of these array of features which can be seen to this day on any ordinary survey maps of the area? Now, this story begins in the mist of time, in the Conwy Valley, and then up to the Carnera Mountains there lived a witch, which was really a bane and nuisance to the people of the valley. The inhabitants of Dyffryn Conwy decided that they had enough of her antics, and the 3 horsemen and hunting dogs were sent up to their hiding place high up in the Carnera Mountain to try and get rid of her. Now, horsemen in Welsh is marchog, which can also be attributed to being a knight, as well as a horseman. Now, they rode up Cwmeigai, up through a pass that led up to the ridges of the Carnera Mountain. And then, after that, this pass was called Bwlch y Tri Marchog, Pass of 3 Horsemen. Once on top of the ridge, close to the top of the nearest mountain, they found the witch. And then she slid down the mountain, and hence this mountain to this day has been called Pen Llithrig o Rach, slippery summit of the witch. In the process of sliding down this mountain, as she turned into a hare to get away from the horsemen and their hunting dogs. Now, this is a common theme in Welsh mythology, that a witch can turn to the form of a hare to get away from her adversaries. The horsemen and the hunting dogs then chased the hare up the next mountain, led by a black hound. And yet again in Welsh mythology, only a black hound can catch and then turn a hare back into a witch. This mountain from then on has been called Pen yr Helgi Du, summit of the black hound. Now, the hare carried on along a very narrow, dangerous ridge pass, hoping this, the horsemen could not follow her. But the bravest horseman, named Anwyl, led the other 2 horsemen across this narrow and dangerous ridge pass. And this pass was thereafter named Bwlch Anwyl Marchog, the Pass of Anwyl the horseman. This ridge pass led towards Carneth Llewellyn, named after the last Prince of Wales, Llewellyn ein Lliw Ola. Before reaching the summit, the hare was tiring, and she turned towards an outcrop of cliffs and stones. These were called Craig y Tri Marchog, Rock of the 3 Horsemen. Here she was turned down to the lake, and the lake was called Lleucu. And on the shores of the lake, at last the black hound caught her with the hare, and she turned back to being a witch, and was drowned in the lake. Lleucu, the name of the lake, is from the old Roman Celtic Lleu, god of light. This lake was deemed to be a sacred lake. And incidentally, the name for my daughter, Lleucu, derives from this name. And that's the end. Thank you.
I then ran my uncle because that's where my father heard the story from, to try and unravel the story's origin further. Then this is where it got a bit interesting. He disagreed with my father's version of events. But to summarise, some aspects were missing in my uncle's version, and some of the main characters of the first story were missing, such as the witch turning into a hare, although he did acknowledge that this is a tendency in Welsh tales. This insight showed me how interesting these tales have become when shared through traditional oral storytelling. However, not everyone has been told these tales as children. I want to share these stories through my work. However, the question is, how do I share these stories without conflicting my personal interpretation of them? This is when the concept of supplying characters came into place. Some of my key finds in terms of Alice's research has followed two separate paths. One in regards to the narrative and the other to the aesthetics. I've always adored Lena Peter's work, however, its ability to take influence and inspiration from folkloric narrative and create her own unique interpretations of them is what truly made me fall in love with her work. It is this element I want my users to be able to achieve through my work. For me, stories are often not about the tales themselves, but people's interpretations and memory of them. Scratch ceramics has always been my favourite in terms of their aesthetics. Their visual identity is so recognisable, it's a beauty within their work I've taken inspiration from. When I began my illustrations, I wanted to highlight the traditional Welsh costume within them. The traditional Welsh dress was worn by women in rural areas of Wales. The distinctive dress was based on a form of bedgown made from wool and worn over a corset. This was teamed with printed neckerchief and a petticoat, apron and knitted stockings. The dress was completed by a high-crowned hat reminiscent of the 17th century fashion and a red caped cloak. Prior to the 18th, early 19th century, there was no such thing as a Welsh national costume. During the 1830s, Lady Llanfair, the wife of the ironmaster in Gwent, was very influential in encouraging the wearing of national dress. She considered it important to establish a Welsh national identity, as at this time many felt their national identity was under threat. She encouraged the use of Welsh language and the wearing of an identifiable Welsh costume, based on the rural woman's traditional dress. Adoption of the costume also coincided with the growth of Welsh nationalism, as the rise of industrialisation was seen as a threat to the traditional agricultural way of life, and as most of the costume was made from wool, this also boosted the Welsh woolen industry. As the 19th century progressed, the wearing of traditional dress became less popular, and by the 1880s the Welsh costume was worn more as an attempt to maintain tradition and celebrate a separate Welsh identity than as an everyday costume. Today, Welsh costume is worn on St David's Day and by performers at concert and the Steddfodau. By pointing the traditional hat upwards slightly, I was able to make the witch more identifiable of being that of a witch's hat, but not much else was changed in her costume. Here is a book that has really inspired my illustration work. It's based on Welsh tales by Mother Not David. I love the way the illustrations themselves tell the stories so well. With my dyslexia, I often flip through the words, thus the photos, for me, were used as a tool to reinforce my understanding of the story. This shows the importance of illustration as a tool to support storytelling. I began to illustrate scenes based on Panhyd Cyrach. I felt I had achieved a sensible style by this point, and began to really enjoy creating these landscapes. After working for so long on these illustrations, I started to feel detached from them and wanted to gain some tactility with them. This is when I decided to create them in three-dimensional form, to sort of experiment with them and create stories of my own with them. Following this is a video of the process of me making these figurines. This video is quite long, so feel free to pass it because it's quite tedious, but also quite therapeutic.
fel darnau o air mewn glo. Wel a di to. Panau no. Wel a di to. Panau no.
Anhygoel cake bach and that's a wrap. So hwnna di virtual sketchbook tip. Make sticker versions of my illustrative characters. I then placed these stickers around my hometown. The thought around this was to try and provoke anyone who noticed these stickers in the future to wonder where they came from. This is a nod to the fact that many place names and stories have a wonder of its origin and who put it there. I would also like to create a deck of cards, sort of like a pocket paper, telling a short version of my favourite stories but without too much description or detail, so again the person using them can interpret their own version of it alongside the characters I've provided. Here is the first draft of cards I've made, and I've also needed to add other characters. After experimenting with the sizes of the characters and the way they feel in my hands, here is the preferred size. Hopefully the clay version will look just like this in the way they feel and the way they look. Thank you very much for watching my portfolio video. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Thank you.